A family isn't a collection of people, it's a collection of secrets. Ours was held together by the thickest, darkest kind, bound tight with the cords of shame and sealed with the wax of public appearance. For most of my life, I believed that was the definition of love, a shared burden of silence. Now at 70, I know better. Love is truth. And the truth of my family was a rot that began long before I was born, a decay hidden beneath the gleaming polish of my grandmother's mahogany dining table. It all comes back to that table. It all comes back to a Sunday. The air in Havenwood, Ohio, always smelled of freshly cut grass and impending rain, a sweet, earthy perfume that promised both life and languor. On Sundays, another scent joined the mix, the savory, heavy aroma of pot roast wafting from a dozen different kitchens. It was the scent of tradition, of piety, of families gathering after church to perform the weekly ritual of togetherness. For our family, it was a command performance, and the stage was always my grandmother Rose's house on Elm Street. That particular Sunday, many decades ago, felt no different from the 100 that had come before it. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the leaves on the maple trees were just beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn. I sat in the passenger seat of my mother's Buick, the vinyl sticking to the back of my 16-year-old legs. My mother, Sarah, drove with a quiet tension in her shoulders, her hands gripping the steering wheel at a perfect 10 and 2. She was a woman who lived her life at 10 and 2, always prepared for a collision she could never seem to avoid. "Did you remember to iron the linen napkins, Emma?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the road. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if asking for a favor she had no right to expect. "Yes, Mom." "This morning. Good. You know how your grandmother is about creases." I knew everything about how my grandmother was. Rose's world was one of smooth surfaces and sharp corners, a place where a single crease in a napkin or a scuff on a shoe was not merely an imperfection, but a sign of moral decay. Her home was a museum of her own rigid perfectionism. Driving toward it felt less like visiting family and more like preparing for inspection. We pulled into the driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound. The house stood exactly as it always did, a 2-story colonial with pristine white siding and glossy black shutters. Manicured rose bushes, my grandmother's pride, lined the walkway like disciplined soldiers. Not a petal was out of place. It was beautiful, the kind of house people pointed to as an example of Havenwood's charm, but to me, its perfection was suffocating. It was a house that didn't seem to breathe. Inside, the air was still and cool, thick with the dueling scents of slow-cooked beef and lemon polish. A grandfather clock in the entryway ticked with a heavy, somber rhythm, each talk a judgment, each tick an expectation. My grandmother stood in the archway to the dining room, wiping her hands on a starched white apron. Rose was not a tall woman, but she possessed a kind of gravitational pull that made everyone around her feel smaller. Her hair was a helmet of silver, her eyes the color of a winter sky, and her mouth was set in a line that could curve into a polite smile, but never seemed to reach a state of genuine warmth. "Sarah, Emma," she said, her voice crisp. It was a greeting, but it sounded like an inventory. "You're just in time. David arrived a few minutes ago." My stomach, already a tight knot of apprehension, cinched tighter. Uncle David. My mother's brother, my grandmother's golden son. To the rest of Havenwood, David was a dream. He was handsome in a way that seemed both classic and modern, with a smile that could disarm the most cynical soul and a laugh that made people want to be near him. He sold insurance, coached Little League, and never missed a Sunday service. He was perfect, just like the house. Just like the roses, and he was the source of the dread that lived permanently in my gut. He was in the dining room, standing by the window, a glass of iced tea in his hand. When he saw us, his face broke into that famous smile. "There are my girls," he boomed, his voice filling the sterile space with a forced, unwelcome warmth. He hugged my mother first, a quick, perfunctory embrace. Then he turned to me. I stood frozen as he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against him. He smelled of aftershave and something else, something uniquely him, a scent that clung to my clothes and my memory. He held on a second too long, his hand sliding down my back in a way that was meant to seem fatherly, but felt proprietary. I could feel my mother's and grandmother's eyes on us. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Learning to be still was my only defense. "You're getting so grown up, Emmy," he murmured into my hair, turning into a real heartbreaker. I pulled away, my own smile a fragile, painted-on thing. "Hi, Uncle David." We took our places at the table. It was set for 4, each plate, each fork, each crystal glass in its precise, unassailable position on the lace tablecloth. This table was Rose's altar, and the Sunday pot roast was her sacrament. The family photos arranged on the mantelpiece behind her watched over us, a gallery of smiling strangers who bore our names. There we were at picnics, on holidays, at David's wedding years ago, before his wife had the good sense to leave him and the town. In every photo we were the perfect family, captured in perfect moments. The lies were so well practiced they almost felt true. The conversation began, as predictable as the meal itself. Rose inquired about the sermon. David told an amusing story about a client. My mother offered small, agreeable comments. I remained silent, focusing on the intricate task of cutting my roast beef into impossibly small pieces. I studied the patterns of the gravy on my plate, the way the light caught the edge of my water glass, anything to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. I felt like a ghost at the table, a silent observer of my own life, present in body, but with my spirit hiding somewhere deep inside. Old Emma's voice whispers to me now, across the chasm of years. "You were not a ghost child. You were a canary. The one they kept in the mine to see if the air was poison. You were choking on it, and they were all pretending to breathe just fine." David was in the middle of a story about the high school football team's chances for the season. His voice was animated, his hands gesturing. Everyone was captivated. He was the sun, and we were the planets held in his orbit by my grandmother's unyielding will. He paused for effect, looking around the table, his eyes landing on me. "And you, Emma," he said, his smile widening. "You're so quiet today. Cat got your tongue?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. "Just listening," I mumbled, my eyes glued to my plate. "She's a thoughtful girl," my grandmother said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was a statement meant to end the inquiry, to put me back in my designated box of being the quiet, unobtrusive child. But David wasn't done. He laughed, a warm rolling sound that made my skin crawl. "Of course she is. A real thinker, this one." He reached across the small space between us and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was not a pat, it was a placement. His hand was heavy, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin fabric of my blouse. It was a casual gesture, one that anyone watching would have seen as affectionate, avuncular, but I felt the pressure of each individual finger, the way his thumb rested just against the curve of my neck. It was an act of ownership, a silent reminder of the secrets we shared, secrets he had created and I was forced to keep. A jolt went through me, sharp and electric, my muscles seized. My back straightened, and my shoulder flinched away from his touch, a small, involuntary spasm of repulsion. It was a tiny movement, a barely perceptible tremor, but in the silent, hyper-aware world of that dining room, it was a gunshot. His hand withdrew instantly, smoothly. His smile didn't falter. He continued his story as if nothing had happened, his transition so seamless that anyone but us would have missed the beat. But we were not just anyone. I risked a glance at my mother. Her eyes, wide for just a second, darted from my face to my uncle's, and then immediately down to her plate. She picked up her fork and took a bite of mashed potatoes, her chewing suddenly deliberate, an act of intense and desperate focus. She had seen it. She had seen the touch, she had seen the flinch, and she had made a conscious choice to see nothing at all. In her silence, in her determined study of her dinner, she was an accomplice. Then I felt my grandmother's gaze. It was not hot like my uncle's touch, but cold and sharp, like a shard of ice. She was looking directly at me, and her eyes held no sympathy, no concern. They held only a chillingly clear command. Be still. Do not make a scene. Do not crack the surface. The disapproval was so palpable it was like a physical force, pressing me back down into my chair, demanding my compliance. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. The sounds of silverware against china seemed unnaturally loud. The ticking of the grandfather clock grew more insistent. I don't remember eating dessert, though I know a slice of apple pie was placed in front of me. I don't remember the drive home, though I know my mother and I sat in the car, encased in a silence that was heavier and more damning than any words could have been. What I remember is lying in my bed that night, the scent of pot roast and my uncle's aftershave still clinging to the air. I stared into the darkness and understood something fundamental. My family was not a fortress built to protect me. It was a beautifully decorated prison, and its walls were not made of stone, but of denial. The Flinch had been a mistake. It was a crack in the façade, a flicker of truth in a house of mirrors, and I knew, with the certainty of a condemned soul, that I would be punished for it. That Sunday was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. That night, the house settled into a silence that was different from the one before. It was no longer a quiet born of routine, but a brittle, watchful stillness. Lying in my bed, I felt the memory of his hand on my shoulder, a phantom weight, a brand. The Flinch had been a mistake, a tremor that had disturbed the placid surface of the water, and now I had to wait for the ripples to reach the shore. In the weeks that followed, the world outside my window shifted. The vibrant blush of early autumn deepened into a rustic, melancholy crimson, and the air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Everything was changing, preparing for the long, cold sleep of winter. And inside me, something was changing too. It began as a subtle wrongness, a dissonance in the familiar rhythm of my own body. I felt a profound weariness that sleep couldn't touch, a bone-deep exhaustion that made climbing the stairs to my bedroom feel like scaling a mountain. My reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, the girl looking back at me pale and shadowed beneath the eyes. My mother noticed, in her own detached way. "You look peaky, Emma," she'd say, her brow furrowed for a moment before smoothing back into its usual placid mask. "Are you getting enough sleep?" I would nod, assuring her I was fine, because fine was the only acceptable answer in our house. Fine was the foundation upon which the entire precarious structure was built. Then came the sickness. The first time it happened, I was in Mr. Henderson's American history class, listening to a lecture on the compromises that led to the Civil War. He was drawing a timeline on the blackboard, the chalk squeaking rhythmically, when a sudden, sickening wave rolled through my stomach. It was hot and acidic. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and the edges of my vision began to swim. "Mr. Henderson's voice faded into a dull drone. The only reality was the churning in my gut and the desperate, primal need to escape. I shot a hand into the air, not waiting to be called on. "May I be excused?" The words came out strangled. He nodded, his expression one of mild annoyance. I half walked, half ran from the room, my hand clamped over my mouth, the metallic taste of bile rising in my throat. I made it to the girls' bathroom just in time, collapsing into the cold privacy of a stall and losing the meager breakfast I'd forced down that morning. I knelt on the grimy tile floor, my body shaking with violent, empty heaves. When it was over, I was trembling and weak, my forehead pressed against the cool metal of the stall door. I thought it was the flu. I prayed it was the flu. The flu was simple. The flu was something you could explain, but it wasn't the flu. It happened again the next morning, and the morning after that. The dawn, once a quiet, hopeful time of day for me, became an enemy. My alarm clock was a starting pistol for a race I could never win. The sickness would arrive with the first rays of light, a faithful, punctual tormentor. I learned to muffle the sound of my retching by turning on the bathroom faucet full blast, the rush of water a poor shield for my shame. I would kneel before the toilet, the porcelain cold against my skin, my body convulsing with a will of its own. It felt like an exorcism, as if my body were trying to violently expel a poison that had taken root deep inside me. Old Emma knows now what that girl could not articulate. They say the body keeps a score. My body wasn't just keeping score. It was screaming the results from the rooftops, and I was doing everything I could to silence it. The poison wasn't in my stomach. It was in my blood. It was in my memory. Each morning became a gauntlet of secrecy. I'd emerge from the bathroom, splashing my face with cold water to hide the pallor, brushing my teeth with a frantic energy to erase the taste. At the breakfast table, my mother would push a plate of toast toward me. "You're not eating again, Emma." You'll waste away to nothing. I'm not hungry, Mom, I'd say, my voice carefully neutral. She would sigh, that familiar, weary sound of a woman who chose not to see. You must be coming down with that bug that's going around. I'll make you some tea. Her remedies were always for simple, acceptable illnesses: a stomach bug, a head cold, a fever. She had no cure for the truth. Her refusal to look closer, to ask the questions that hovered in the air between us, was a wall she built around herself, and it left me utterly alone on the other side. The world, which had once felt open and full of possibility, shrank to the size of my secret. At school, I walked the hallways in a state of high alert. Laughter sounded too loud. The bright fluorescent lights felt like an interrogation. I'd see my friends from a distance and change direction, unable to face their easy chatter, their innocent questions about boys and homework. Their world was no longer my world. I was an astronaut whose tether had been cut, drifting in a cold, silent orbit, while the life I once knew continued on far below. The past was not the past. It was a constant, lurking presence. One afternoon, walking to my locker, a junior boy from the football team hurried past, leaving the scent of a sharp, familiar aftershave in his wake. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, I wasn't in the crowded, noisy hallway of Havenwood High anymore. I was in my bedroom, the moonlight striping the floor. The scent was there, filling the space, thick and suffocating. A shadow fell across my door, large and absolute, and a voice, his voice, whispered from the darkness. "This is our secret, Emmy. Just ours." I gasped, dropping my books. They hit the linoleum floor with a deafening clatter. A girl nearby turned to look at me. "You okay, Emma?" she asked. I could only nod, my heart hammering against my ribs as I scrambled to gather my things, the ghost of his voice still echoing in my ears. The feeling of being trapped was constant. It was the click of my bedroom door latching, the sight of his car parked outside my grandmother's house, the way my own body had become a cage. The sickness was a physical manifestation of this entrapment, a revolt from within. My body knew the truth before my mind would allow itself to fully accept it. The inevitable confrontation with him came on a Tuesday. I was home from school, claiming a headache, when he stopped by unannounced to drop off some paperwork for my mother. She was in the kitchen, and I was in the living room, pretending to read. He walked in, and the room seemed to shrink. "Hey there, stranger," he said, his voice full of that effortless charm. "Mom said you weren't feeling well." I kept my eyes on my book, my knuckles white where I gripped the cover. "I'm fine, just a headache." He stood over me for a moment. I could feel his gaze on the top of my head. "You look a little pale," he said softly. His tone was one of perfect, solicitous concern. But underneath it, I heard the triumphant hum of his power. He knew. He had to know. The paleness, the sickness, it was all his handiwork. This wasn't concern. It was an artist admiring his creation. He was reminding me that he was the author of my misery, and that he could walk in and out of it whenever he pleased, smiling. The final piece of the horrifying puzzle clicked into place that night. As I lay in bed, I did the terrible arithmetic I had been avoiding for weeks. I counted the days, then the weeks, since the last time the world had felt safe, since before that night at the end of the summer, a night I had tried to bury under a mountain of denial. I counted forward from there, and the number I landed on was a cold, hard stone in the pit of my stomach. I thought of the sickness that came every morning. I thought of the date of my last monthly cycle, and the one that never came. Denial was a luxury I could no longer afford. The sickness wasn't a bug. The exhaustion wasn't from a lack of sleep. It wasn't a poison I could expel. It was a life I hadn't asked for, a life that was the result of a crime, growing inside me. The secret he had forced upon me now had a heartbeat. I sat up in bed, the darkness of my room absolute. The terror was so immense, so complete that it transcended tears. It was a cold, silent certainty that hollowed me out from the inside. He had not just violated my body and stolen my peace. He had planted his secret inside me, and it was growing, preparing to announce itself to the world. The quiet, observant girl was gone, and in her place was someone I didn't recognize. A girl holding a truth so catastrophic it threatened to burn everything she had ever known to the ground. I was sick in the silence, but I knew, with a chilling finality, that the silence was about to be broken. I needed proof. I needed to see it for myself, in a language that could not be argued with or denied. The knowing was a sickness of its own. It was a fever in my mind, a constant low-grade hum of terror that clouded every thought and soured every moment. For days, I existed in this state of unconfirmed certainty, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. The world continued its steady, oblivious rhythm. The school bell rang. My mother worried about dinner. The leaves fell from the trees, while I was frozen in the amber of my horrifying secret. But this paralysis could not last. A secret known only to oneself is a ghost, but a secret confirmed is a monster. I needed to face the monster. I needed to give it a name. I needed proof. The plan formed in the dead of night, a desperate piece of architecture built from fear and necessity. I couldn't go to Gable's pharmacy on Main Street. Mr. Gable had given me cherry-flavored medicine for earaches when I was 5 and sold my mother her monthly supply of aspirins. His kind, crinkly eyes would see too much. In Havenwood, there were no anonymous transactions. Every purchase was a piece of data to be filed away in the town's collective consciousness. No, it had to be somewhere else. It had to be Millfield. Millfield was the next town over, a place we only went to for bulk groceries or back-to-school shoes. It was 10 miles and a universe away. It had a bus station and a sprawling, impersonal drugstore where no one knew my name or my mother's name or the story of how my father had left us years ago to be absorbed into the charity and control of my grandmother's family. Millfield was a place where I could be, for one terrifying hour, invisible. The money was the first obstacle. I kept my savings in a chipped porcelain music box on my dresser, a relic from a childhood that now felt like it belonged to someone else. It played a tinny, cheerful version of Fur-Elise. I opened it, and the melody began its maddeningly innocent tune. Inside, nestled in the worn velvet lining, were 3 $5 bills and a handful of change. Money I had been carefully saving to buy a new album by a band my mother would have disapproved of. The irony was a bitter pill. The small, secret dreams of a 16-year-old girl were now being cashed in to purchase the confirmation of a nightmare. I scooped up the bills, their crispness feeling profane in my trembling hand, and silenced the music box by shutting the lid. The next day, I told my mother I was going to the library to work on a history paper. It was a lie, but a plausible one, the kind that didn't invite further questions. The bus ride was a study in isolation. I pressed my forehead against the cool, vibrating glass of the window and watched Havenwood recede. The familiar houses, the town square, the steeple of the church, it all looked like a miniature set from a movie, a perfect, unreal place I no longer belonged to. The other passengers were strangers lost in their own worlds. A woman knitting, an old man asleep with his mouth open, 2 teenage boys laughing loudly in the back. I was an island of pure terror in a sea of mundane, everyday life. The drugstore in Millfield was exactly what I needed it to be, large, bright, and utterly indifferent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glare on the endless aisles. I walked through the store with a feigned purpose, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I passed the greeting cards, the candy aisle, the towering wall of vitamins. Finally, I found it, tucked away in an aisle marked Feminine Needs. The box was small and clinical, its design plain, its purpose devastating. It felt like it was radiating heat. My hand shook as I reached for it, my fingers closing around the smooth cardboard. For a moment, I just stood there, clutching the box, convinced that every person in the store was watching me, that an alarm was about to go off, exposing me. The journey to the checkout counter was the longest walk of my life. I kept my head down, my hair falling around my face like a curtain. I placed the box on the counter along with a pack of gum, a pathetic attempt at camouflage. The cashier was a young woman with bored eyes and chewing gum. She didn't even look at me. She rang up the items, her movements automatic. "That'll be $4.27, she said, snapping her gum. I fumbled with the bills I had clutched in my pocket, my sweaty fingers making them stick together. I smoothed them out on the counter and pushed them toward her. She swept them up, gave me my change, and dropped the box and the gum into a small, white paper bag. The crinkle of the bag was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I didn't wait for the bus. I walked the whole way back to the edge of town, the bag clutched in my hand like a bomb. The 10-mile walk was a blur of gravel shoulders and passing cars. My body moved on autopilot, driven by a single, desperate imperative: to get home, to lock myself in the bathroom, to face the truth. The house was empty. My mother was at her part-time job at the town clerk's office. The silence was a blessing. I crept up the stairs, my feet silent on the runner. I locked the bathroom door behind me, the click of the bolt echoing in the small, tiled room. I leaned against the door, my eyes closed, taking a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back. The box felt cold in my hands. I tore it open, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The instructions inside were a diagram of clinical steps, a cold scientific process for a moment that was anything but. I followed them like a robot, my mind numb, my body moving through the required motions. Then came the wait. The instructions said 3 minutes, 3 minutes to decide the entire course of the rest of my life. It was an eternity. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the test lying flat on the closed lid of the toilet, and I stared at the small, blank window. I didn't pray with words. My prayer was a single, silent, desperate scream from the deepest part of my soul. Please, please, just one. Let there be just one line. I watched, holding my breath, as the seconds ticked by. A line began to appear, a faint slash of pink bleeding across the white background. Hope, fragile and agonizing, fluttered in my chest. Just one. That's it. It's just one. But then, behind it, another presence began to emerge. It was a ghost at first, a faint, shadowy suggestion of a second line. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, willing it to disappear. But it didn't. It grew darker, sharper, more defined, until it stood beside the first one, an equal partner in my condemnation. It was not a maybe, it was not a ghost, it was a fact. Two perfect, pink, irrefutable lines. The world did not so much dissolve as it fractured. The hum of the lights faded to nothing. The white tiles of the floor seemed to rush up at me, then recede. My breath left my body in a single, silent gasp, and for a long moment, I forgot how to draw it back in. There were no tears. The shock was too deep, too absolute for something as simple as crying. It was a hollowing out, a quiet detonation in the center of my being that left nothing but a ringing emptiness. The voice of old Emma, calm and clear across the decades, speaks the truth of that moment. It wasn't a baby, not then. It was a sentence. A verdict, delivered in a language only my body could speak, in a script of 2 pink lines. I had been tried and found guilty, and my crime was my own silence. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the plastic oracle on the toilet lid. Minutes. An hour. Time had ceased to have meaning, but eventually a single, clear thought cut through the fog of terror. It was not a plan. It was an instinct, a primal scream for help from a child lost in a dark and terrifying forest. There was only one person in the world I could turn to, only one person whose job, whose fundamental purpose, was to protect me. Her weakness, her fear, her determined blindness, none of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the biological fact of her. My mother. I had to tell my mother. My legs were shaky, alien things as I stood up. I picked up the test, the plastic now warm from my hand. It felt impossibly heavy. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped into the hallway. Each step toward her bedroom, where I knew she would be now, home from work, was a step toward a new, unknown kind of devastation. I was no longer just a girl with a secret. I was a girl with proof. And proof was a thing that could not be ignored. It had to be dealt with. I was about to find out how my family dealt with the truth. The hallway seemed to stretch for miles. Each floorboard I crossed groaned under my weight, a sound that felt like a betrayal in the quiet house. My mother's bedroom door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the gloom of the hallway. Inside, I could hear the small, rhythmic snip of scissors. She was likely at her sewing table, mending a hem or replacing a button, her hands engaged in one of the small domestic acts of repair that defined her life. It gave me a pang of hope. A mother who could fix things might be able to fix this. My own cowardice warred with my desperation. I stood outside her door for a full minute, the plastic test clutched in my hand, my knuckles white. Then, taking a breath that didn't seem to fill my lungs, I pushed the door open. She was sitting in her armchair, a basket of mending beside her, a pair of my father's old work trousers draped across her lap. He had been gone for nearly a decade, but she still mended his things, as if by keeping his clothes intact, she could prevent his memory from fraying completely. Her room, like the rest of her life, was neat, orderly, and colorless. The walls were a faded beige, the curtains a plain off-white. There were no pictures on her nightstand, no trinkets, no splash of personality. It was the room of a woman who had learned not to take up too much space. She looked up as I entered, her expression of mild surprise quickly melting into concern as she saw my face. "Emma! What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't speak. Words were useless things, flimsy nets trying to capture a monster. Instead, I simply opened my hand and held out the test. The 2 pink lines seemed to glow in the soft lamplight. She squinted, her head tilting. "What on earth is that, honey?" She put the trousers aside and took it from my hand. Her fingers brushed against mine, and her skin was cool. She held the small plastic stick close to her face, turning it over. For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the sewing machine she'd left running. Then I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, followed instantly by a wave of utter disbelief. "No," she whispered, her voice thin. She looked from the test to my face, her eyes wide and searching, begging me to deny it. "No, this is some kind of mistake. A joke. These things, they're not reliable, are they?" Her denial was a flimsy shield, and she knew it. She looked back at the test, her hand beginning to tremble. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the terrible object in her hand. Then came the question I had been dreading, the one I knew she had to ask. Her voice was barely audible, a thread of sound. "Who?" The name was a block of ice in my throat. It was too huge, too monstrous to be spoken aloud. To say his name would be to make it real in a new and terrifying way. I could only shake my head, a dam of unshed tears finally breaking. Sobs racked my body, silent, convulsive things that offered no release. I saw the answer dawn on her face, not because she knew, but because she saw the sheer, abject terror in my eyes, and she understood that this was not a simple teenage mistake. This was something far worse, and in that moment I watched my mother make a choice. I saw her stand at a fork in the road of her own soul. One path led to me. It was a dark, thorny, and terrifying path, one that would require a strength and courage she had never been forced to possess. It was the path of a mother. The other path led away from me, toward safety, toward the familiar tyranny she had lived under her entire life. It was the path of a daughter. She chose to be a daughter. The fear that washed over her face was not for me. I saw it as clearly as I saw the 2 pink lines. It was a primal, selfish terror. She was not seeing her 16-year-old child broken and brutalized. She was seeing my grandmother's face, contorted in rage. She was hearing the sound of the family's good name shattering like glass. She was feeling the ground of her own precarious existence begin to tremble. I was not her child in pain. I was a catastrophe that had landed in her lap. I know now, the voice of old Emma says, a sad, calm echo in my mind, that cowardice is not a simple thing. It is a slow poison, taken in small doses over a lifetime. She had been drinking it for years, at every Sunday dinner, in every silent acquiescence, in every averted gaze. She had no antidote left for a moment like this. She had no strength to give me because she had none for herself. The shift in her was terrifying to behold. The softness in her face hardened into a mask of panicked resolve. Her fear morphed into a cold, frantic energy. She stood up, the mending basket tumbling to the floor, spools of thread rolling under the chair. She didn't notice. She wasn't my mother anymore. She was a soldier taking orders from an unseen general. "Get up," she said, her voice sharp, stripped of all its usual hesitancy. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep. Her grip was not comforting. It was the grip of an arresting officer. "We have to go to your grandmother's." "Right now." The words made no sense. "What? Mom? No," I stammered through my sobs. We need to talk." "There is nothing to talk about," she snapped, her eyes wild. "This is not for me to handle. This is for your grandmother." She was already pulling me toward the door, her other hand grabbing her purse and keys from the dresser. She was abdicating responsibility so fast it gave me whiplash. She was not just refusing to help me, she was actively, physically delivering me to my executioner. "Go wash your face," she commanded, pushing me toward the bathroom. "And for God's sake, put on a different sweater, not that one." It was a new sweater, one I loved. Her rejection of it felt like a rejection of me, of any part of my identity that wasn't broken and ashamed. Her only concern was presentation. We were not going for help. We were going to present a problem, and the problem needed to be packaged correctly. The drive to Rose's house was a journey into the abyss. We sat in the Buick, the engine's hum the only sound. The silence was a third passenger, a malevolent entity that filled all the space between us. I stared out the window, watching the familiar houses of Havenwood glide past like scenery in a nightmare. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant, beautiful shades of orange and pink, a cruel mockery of the ugliness of our mission. I risked a glance at my mother. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her jaw so tight I could see the muscles twitching. She was staring straight ahead, her face a stone mask. The woman who had given birth to me, who had read me bedtime stories and kissed my scraped knees, was gone. In her place was this stranger, this terrified woman who was willing to sacrifice her own child on the altar of her mother's approval. The dawning horror I'd felt in the script of my life became a cold, hard reality. I was not being taken to be saved. I was not being taken to be protected. I was a piece of evidence being delivered to the scene of a crime, and the judge, jury, and chief prosecutor were all waiting for me in a pristine white house with black shutters, behind a door that was about to open and swallow me whole. My mother pulled the car into my grandmother's driveway. She turned off the engine, and the sudden, absolute silence was deafening. She turned to me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of her old self in her eyes, a flicker of pain, of apology. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that cold, hard resolve. "Let me do the talking," she said. It was not a request. It was an order. Then she opened her car door, and the brief, terrible journey was over. The trial was about to begin. The walk from the car to the front door was the longest 10 yards of my life. Each step on the flagstone path felt heavy, as if my feet were sinking into wet cement. The lights inside my grandmother's house cast a warm, inviting glow through the pristine windows, a beacon of familial warmth that I knew was a lie. The house was a Venus flytrap, beautiful and promising from the outside, but designed to close in on you, to suffocate you in its sweet, sick embrace. My mother rang the doorbell, a cheerful, two-note chime that sounded like a death knell. The door opened, and my grandmother stood there, framed in the light. She was no longer in her apron. She had changed into a tailored wool dress, her silver hair immaculate, her face a carefully composed mask of concern. It was clear my mother had called ahead, her panicked, incoherent whispers over the phone enough to summon the matriarch to full alert. Rose's eyes flickered past my mother's tear-streaked face and landed on me. Her gaze was not questioning. It was assessing. She was a general surveying a battlefield, trying to gauge the extent of the damage. "Get inside," she said, her voice low and steady. She pulled us in and shut the door with a heavy final click, sealing us off from the rest of the world. We were led not to the kitchen, the heart of the home, but to the formal living room, the museum. It was a room designed for presentation, not for comfort. The sofas were stiff, the armchairs unforgiving, the air still and smelling faintly of potpourri and old wood. The gallery of smiling family photos on the mantelpiece seemed to mock us. This was Rose's courtroom. "Now, Sarah," Rose began, turning to my mother. "Stop your weeping and tell me what has happened. Your call made no sense." My mother, who had pledged in the car to do the talking, completely disintegrated. Her composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, Mother," she sobbed, collapsing into one of the stiff armchairs. It's "It's Emma. It's a terrible, terrible situation." She couldn't articulate it. The shame was too great, the fear of my grandmother too absolute. She could only weep, abdicating her role once more, leaving me standing alone in the center of the room, the subject of Rose's cold, unwavering stare. "Emma." My grandmother's voice cut through my mother's sobs like glass. "Your mother is useless. You will tell me what this is about." My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unclench my fist. I held out the plastic test. It was the only language I had left. Rose took a few steps forward and snatched it from my hand. She examined it under the light of a standing lamp, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sounds were my mother's muffled crying and the solemn tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. Rose did not gasp. She did not cry out. Her face hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening. Her control was absolute, terrifying. She placed the test on the polished surface of a side table as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. Then she turned and walked to the telephone on the wall. Her movements were deliberate, precise. She picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. "David," she said into the phone, her voice a low, steel wire. "I need you to come to the house, now." "It is a family matter." She listened for a second, then said, "I will explain when you arrive," and hung up. The wait was the purest form of torture I have ever known. The 10 minutes it took for my uncle to drive across town felt like 10 years. My mother's sobs subsided into pathetic, intermittent hitches of breath. I stood rooted to the spot on the Persian rug, my arms wrapped around myself, a prisoner awaiting the arrival of my co-conspirator, my accuser. Rose did not sit. She paced the length of the room, her hands clasped behind her back, her face a thundercloud of controlled fury. She was not processing grief or shock. She was formulating a strategy. When the doorbell chimed again, my whole body flinched. Rose opened it, and there he was. My Uncle David, his face a perfect mask of concern. "Mom?" "What is it? Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice dripping with false sincerity as he rushed to my mother's side. He put a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into his touch, a silent, devastating betrayal. He looked from her to my grandmother, and then, finally, his eyes landed on me. He held my gaze for a fraction of a second, and in that flicker of time I saw it. A flash of triumph, a glint of cruel satisfaction. He knew. He knew why he was here. "Sit down, David," Rose commanded. She was now the judge, calling her court to order. He sat on the sofa opposite my mother. Rose remained standing, looming over all of us. She gestured toward the empty space on the sofa beside my uncle. "Emma, sit." It was not a request. I moved on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and sat on the edge of the cushion, as far from him as I could get. The air was electric, with unspoken horror. "Now," Rose began, her eyes boring into me, "Emma has something to tell us." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "She has made an accusation, and I want her to say it to your face. Emma!" "Tell your uncle what you have done." What you have done, not what was done to you. The verdict had already been reached. I looked at my uncle. He was staring at me, his handsome face arranged into an expression of gentle, worried confusion. He was a master of his art. My throat was closed, my tongue thick and useless. I couldn't breathe. "Speak, child," Rose commanded, her voice dangerously quiet. I took a ragged breath. The words came out in a choked whisper, small and pathetic in the vast, silent room. "I'm pregnant." I saw my uncle's eyes widen in feigned shock. I had to force the rest out, the words that would sign my own death warrant. My voice was barely audible. "He's the father, my uncle." The last words were lost in a sob, but they had been heard. The effect was instantaneous and perfectly choreographed. David gasped, a theatrical sound of pure disbelief. He recoiled from me on the sofa as if I had struck him. His face crumpled, the image of a man betrayed to his very soul. "What?" he choked out, his eyes welling with crocodile tears. He looked at Rose, his voice breaking. "Mother, no. How could she say that? How could you even think? I would never. I love this family. She's my niece, my little Emmy. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. It was a flawless performance. He was the victim. He was the one who had been wounded. I watched him, mesmerized by the artistry of his lies. And then I felt the full, concentrated force of my grandmother's fury turn on me. She moved to stand directly in front of me, forcing me to look up at her. Her face was a mask of cold, righteous rage. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a shout. It was far worse. It was a low, venomous hiss, each word a drop of poison. You are tearing this family apart. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. They knocked the air from my lungs and the light from the world. Look at him, she hissed, gesturing toward her weeping son. Look at what your lies are doing to this good man, a man who has given everything to this family, to this town. You were always a strange, quiet little thing, always watching from the corners. I see it now. The jealousy, the malice. You couldn't stand to see him happy, to see this family whole. She took a step closer, her voice dropping even lower. You have your father's weakness in you, the same selfish streak that made him abandon his family. You want to destroy what you cannot have. So you concoct this filthy story. You try to ruin the one man who has been a rock for us all, and for what? For attention. Out of some sick, twisted fantasy? She leaned down until her face was inches from mine. I will not let you. I will not let a lying, hysterical little girl destroy the name my family has built in this town for 50 years. You have brought this shame into my house, and you will be the one to bear it, not him. Her decree hung in the air, absolute and final. I looked past her to my mother, a last, desperate, silent appeal. My mother was no longer looking at me. She had moved to the sofa and put a comforting arm around her brother's heaving shoulders, murmuring, "It's okay, David. We know. We know the truth." That was the moment I shattered. It wasn't a loud, violent breaking, but a silent, internal crumbling into dust. My soul, my sense of self, my belief that truth had any meaning at all, it all disintegrated. I had walked into that room with a horrifying truth, and they had taken it from me, twisted it, and beaten me with it. They had erased me. In my own family's courtroom, I had been declared a non-person. My experience did not happen. My pain was a lie. My life was a fiction. The three of them were a united front now, the matriarch, the golden son, and the cowardly daughter. They were the family. And I, with the undeniable, growing truth inside my body, was the outsider, the enemy, the saboteur. The decree had been issued. I was guilty, and my sentence was just beginning. The car ride home was a descent into a new kind of silence. The tense, crackling quiet on the way to my grandmother's house had been replaced by something far heavier, something cold and dead. It was the silence of a closed case, of a verdict rendered and a sentence passed. My mother drove with a rigid, focused calm, her hand steady on the wheel. The weeping, hysterical woman from my grandmother's living room had been put away, and in her place was an enforcer, a woman whose face was set like concrete. She had chosen her side. She had chosen them. We entered our own home, not as mother and daughter, but as jailer and prisoner. I went straight to my room, the only space that had ever felt truly mine, but its familiarity offered no comfort. It felt tainted, violated. The air was thick with the residue of the afternoon's horror. I lay on my bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I was far beyond tears. I was in a state of pure, hollow shock, my soul anesthetized. I heard my mother moving around downstairs, the clinking of dishes, the running of water. She was washing up from a dinner we never ate, her hands performing the mundane tasks of a life that had just been irrevocably shattered. Her ability to simply continue, to wash a plate while my world ended, was perhaps the most profound cruelty of all. The new regime began the next morning. I woke to the sound of my grandmother's voice in the hallway, sharp and commanding. I didn't need to hear the words to know that the warden had arrived to inspect her prison. A few minutes later, my mother opened my bedroom door without knocking. Behind her stood Rose. dressed in a severe navy blue suit, her purse held in front of her like a shield. "Get dressed, Emma," Rose said, her eyes sweeping across my room, taking in my books, my records, the small tokens of my former life. "Your mother and I need to speak with you." I sat at the kitchen table while they stood over me, a two-person tribunal. "There are going to be some changes," Rose began, her voice devoid of any emotion. "For your own well-being, you will not be returning to school for the time being." "What will you tell them?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I have already spoken to Principal Thompson this morning," she said, a note of pride in her efficiency. "I have informed him that you are suffering from a severe case of nervous exhaustion and will require an extended period of rest at home." He was most understanding. She had created the story, the official narrative that would seal me away. The lie was already in motion, spreading through the town's nervous system while I sat there, powerless. "You will not be leaving the house," she continued, "and you will not be speaking with your friends." She turned and looked at the telephone on the wall. "Sarah, go and get her phone." My mother hesitated for only a second before turning and walking obediently toward my bedroom. She came back a moment later holding my pale yellow rotary phone, its cord dangling uselessly. She wouldn't meet my eyes as she handed it to my grandmother. Rose took it and placed it on the counter with an air of finality. My last link to the outside world, to anyone who might still see me as me, was gone. "You will remain here in this house where we can look after you," Rose said. "You will eat the meals your mother prepares. You will have time to think about the trouble you have caused, the lies you have told, and the pain you have inflicted on this family. Perhaps in time, you will come to your senses." And with that, the cage door was shut and locked. My own home, the house I grew up in, became my prison. The windows were no longer for looking out at the world, but for looking at a life I was forbidden from joining. The passing cars, the kids riding their bikes, the mailman making his daily rounds. They were all part of a world that no longer included me. Time stretched and warped, losing all its familiar markers. Days were measured only by the 3 meals my mother would bring to my room on a tray, setting it down on my desk without a word before quietly leaving and closing the door behind her. The silence was the worst part. The house, once filled with the low hum of the radio or the television, was now perpetually quiet, as if in mourning, but it was a watchful silence, a silence of surveillance. I felt their eyes on me, even when they weren't there. My mother would pass my open doorway, and her gaze would slide over me, full of a pained, guilty avoidance. She was miserable, I could see that, but her misery was for herself, for the difficult role she was being forced to play. Once, in a moment of desperate folly, I tried to appeal to her. She had just brought my lunch, and as she turned to leave, I spoke her name. "Mom?" She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, her back to me. "What is it, Emma?" "Please," I whispered. "Please, just talk to me. Don't you see what's happening?" She was silent for a long moment. I saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep, shuddering breath. "You need to eat your sandwich," she said, her voice strained. "Your grandmother will be by later to check on you." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with the untouched food and the crushing weight of her cowardice. Rose's visits were different. They were inspections. She would walk into my room, her eyes scanning for any sign of rebellion. She spoke to me as a doctor might speak to a difficult patient, her tone condescending, clinical. "Are you feeling more rational today, Emma? Have you given any thought to the damage your stories could have caused?" She never mentioned David's name. He was the unspoken, untouchable center of our family's twisted universe. She was not there to comfort. She was there to reinforce my guilt, to chip away at my reality until only hers remained. She was trying to convince me that I was insane, and some days in the suffocating quiet of that room, I almost believed her. The most exquisite form of torture, however, was my uncle's continued presence. The Sunday dinners at Rose's house stopped. Instead, they began to happen at ours. It was a strategic move, ensuring I could not escape, forcing me to participate in the grotesque performance of our family's normalcy. I would be made to sit at the table with them, a ghost at my own feast. David would walk in, smiling, kissing my mother on the cheek and nodding curtly to me. He would talk about his work, about a football game, about some trivial piece of town gossip. He addressed all his conversation to my mother and grandmother, rendering me invisible, but he knew I was there. Throughout the meal, while my mother and grandmother were distracted, he would let his eyes find me. He would look at me over the rim of his water glass, and his expression was not one of anger or malice. It was something far more devastating. The script in my head calls it triumphant pity, and that is exactly what it was. It was the calm, satisfied look of a predator who has successfully trapped and broken its prey. His eyes said it all. Look at you. Look at what I did to you. I won. I will always win. You are nothing. Then he would turn back to my mother and laugh at something she said, the perfect, charming son and brother, leaving me to choke on the silence and my food. After one of those dinners, after he and my grandmother had left, I went back to my room and stood in front of the mirror. The girl looking back at me was a stranger. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes dull and empty. The life, the spark, the 16-year-old girl who loved music and laughed with her friends was gone. They had taken her and locked her away. In her place was this specter, this inmate. The cage was not just the four walls of my room. It was my own body, which was changing in ways I could no longer hide from myself. It was my own mind, which was beginning to fray under the constant, silent pressure of their monstrous lie. I was at the bottom of a deep, dark well, and as I looked up, I could see no light, no hope of rescue, no sign that this gilded cage would ever let me go. Despair is a quiet country. In the weeks that followed my sentencing, I became its sole inhabitant. The world outside my bedroom window continued its indifferent pageant. The leaves finished their descent, leaving the branches of the trees like stark, black skeletons against a gray sky. Winter was coming. I felt it not just in the chill that seeped through the window panes, but in the ice that had formed around my own heart. My spirit, once a frantic bird beating against the bars of its cage, had grown tired. It sat huddled in a corner, waiting for the end. I had begun to believe their story. Perhaps I was the monster. Perhaps I had imagined it all. Madness felt closer and more comforting than the truth. But even in the deepest despair, the instinct to survive is a stubborn, primordial thing. It came to me not as a courageous roar, but as a flicker, a tiny defiant spark in the suffocating darkness. I was watching a lone sparrow land on the branch outside my window. It was so small, so fragile against the vast, empty sky, yet it sang. It sang its small, simple song into the cold air, without any promise of an audience, and I thought, I am still here. I have a voice, even if no one is listening. That night, for the first time in weeks, I did something other than simply exist. I rebelled. After my mother had collected my dinner tray and the house had fallen into its usual deadened silence, I slid out of bed and knelt by my old school trunk. Underneath a pile of yearbooks and old sweaters, I found what I was looking for, a half-used spiral notebook and a pen. By the thin, watery light of the moon, I began to write. It was not a letter, it was a testament. The words poured out of me, frantic and messy. I wrote down everything. I wrote David's name again and again, forcing myself to conquer the monstrous shape of it. I described the Sunday dinners, the lingering touches, the scent of his aftershave. I wrote about the 2 pink lines, my mother's terrified face, the silent, damning car ride. I wrote my grandmother's exact words, her decree, etching them onto the page like a curse. You are tearing this family apart. I wrote about my imprisonment, the silence, the looks of triumphant pity. I filled page after page, my hand cramping, until my entire story was there, a tangible object, a physical manifestation of the truth they were trying to erase. I folded the pages into a small, thick square and hid it under my mattress. It was a foolish, desperate act, a message in a bottle from a girl shipwrecked in the middle of her own home. But it was mine. My chance to send it came a week later. My grandmother, in her cold, calculating way, had decided it was time for my condition to be medically managed. It was not a matter of my health, but a matter of her control. She needed data. She needed a timeline. She needed a professional opinion from someone she owned. And so, a visit was arranged with Dr. Miller, A man who had been our family physician for 30 years, a man who had set my mother's broken arm and attended my grandmother's annual Christmas party. The car ride was a silent torment. I sat beside Rose, the folded letter a burning square in my coat pocket. Seeing the world again was dizzying. The familiar streets of Havenwood looked strange and hyper-real after my confinement. I felt like a ghost haunting a town that had already forgotten me. Dr. Miller's office was warm and paneled in dark wood, filled with the scent of antiseptic and old paper. He was a kind-looking man with white hair and a gentle, paternalistic manner that was more terrifying than any overt cruelty. He spoke almost exclusively to my grandmother. "Well, Rose," he said, patting her hand, "let's see what we can do for the little one." I was not a person. I was a problem to be solved between them. He took my weight and my blood pressure, his movements efficient and impersonal. Then he asked my grandmother to step into his private office to discuss the situation. For a few precious minutes, I was left alone in the examination room with the nurse. She was a plump, cheerful woman, also named Miller, his wife. She tidied up the room, humming softly. "It's a difficult time for you, I'm sure, dear," she said, her voice full of a practiced sympathy. My heart hammered in my chest. This was my chance. It was my only chance. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling as I pulled the letter from my pocket. "Please, can you help me? This is a letter. It has to get out." Can you mail it for me? Please don't tell them." She stopped humming and looked at me. Her expression was one of pure, pitying kindness. She took the letter from my shaking hand and tucked it into the pocket of her starched white uniform. She patted my hand. "Don't you worry about a thing, you poor dear," she said, her smile never wavering. "Everything will be all right." A wave of relief so profound it almost made me sick washed over me. Hope. It was a feeling so foreign I had almost forgotten its existence. Someone had listened. Someone was going to help. The car ride home was just as silent as the ride there, but this time I didn't care. I let the silence be. I had done it. I had sent my SOS. I had thrown my bottle into the sea. We walked into the house and my grandmother gestured for me to sit at the kitchen table. She went to her purse, which she had set on the counter, and took something out. It was my letter, my thick square of folded pages. She dropped it on the table in front of me. "Did you really think," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper of contempt, "that a hysterical girl's scribblings would mean more to Martha Miller than the good name of a family she has known for 30 years? Did you really think you could find an ally? There are no allies for you, Emma, not here." The hope that had fluttered in my chest died a violent, instantaneous death. The walls of the cage, which for a brief moment had seemed to recede, now snapped back into place, closer and tighter than ever before. I had not only failed, I had proven to her that I was still fighting, and my sentence was now extended indefinitely. I had learned a devastating lesson. My grandmother's power was not confined to the walls of our house. It was woven into the very fabric of the town. There was no escape. But a crack of light doesn't always appear where you are looking. Sometimes it shines on you from the outside. Miles away, at Havenwood High, Ms. Albright sat at her desk, a stack of student files in front of her. She was a guidance counselor, younger than most of the other teachers, a recent transplant from a city far away. She hadn't yet been fully indoctrinated into Havenwood's culture of silence. She frowned as she looked at my file. Emma Miller, good student, perfect attendance, quiet, no history of any trouble. She remembered my sharp, insightful answers in class discussions. It didn't fit. She tapped her pen on her desk, replaying the phone calls in her head. A few weeks ago, she had called my house for a routine check-in. My mother had answered, her voice strained, saying I was ill. Last week, she had called again. My grandmother had answered that time, her voice polite but firm as steel, informing her that I was suffering from nervous exhaustion and was under a doctor's care and could not be disturbed. It all felt too neat, too final. The words nervous exhaustion were a screen, a curtain pulled across a window she wasn't meant to look through. Good students didn't just vanish into a cloud of vague, Victorian-sounding ailments. Her professional instincts, the ones that had been trained to spot the subtle signs of a child in crisis, were screaming. This wasn't protection. This felt like gatekeeping. This felt like a family hiding something. She looked at my school picture in the file, at the quiet, serious-looking girl with the intelligent eyes. Something was deeply wrong. She stood up, a sudden resolve hardening her features. She couldn't call again. That path was blocked. But there was nothing stopping her from making a house call. She could frame it as just dropping off some missed assignments, a friendly, professional check-in. It was the least she could do. It was her job. She grabbed her purse and her car keys from her desk. As she walked out of her office and into the empty late-afternoon hallway, she had no idea that she was no longer just a guidance counselor. She was an invading army, a force of nature heading directly for the carefully constructed, heavily fortified prison where I was being held. The crack of light was coming, and it was coming in the form of a knock on the front door. The silence in my prison had become my new normal. It was a thick, heavy blanket I had learned to wrap myself in. The world had shrunk to the four walls of my room, the pattern of the wallpaper, the slow, relentless march of dust motes in a stray sunbeam. I was at the bottom of the well, and I had stopped looking up. The failed letter, the nurse's betrayal, had been the last handful of dirt thrown down on top of me. My grandmother was right. There were no allies for me. So when the doorbell rang on that gray Tuesday afternoon, the sound was an alien intrusion, a shock to the deadened nervous system of the house. It was a sharp, cheerful chime, the same one that had announced my grandmother's arrival on the day my sentence began. Downstairs, I heard the television abruptly cut off. I heard the rustle of my mother rising from the sofa. I crept to my bedroom door, my heart giving a strange, unfamiliar flutter. It wasn't hope. It was a primal, animal curiosity, the instinct of a caged creature sensing a change in the atmosphere. I heard my mother open the front door. A woman's voice, calm and professional, drifted up the stairs. "Good afternoon. I'm Susan Albright from the high school. I'm Emma's guidance counselor." I was in the neighborhood and just wanted to drop off some of her missed assignments and see how she was doing. My mother's response was a flustered, stammering mess. "Oh, Ms. Albright, we weren't expecting anyone. Emma is resting." The doctor was very clear. Her voice was tight with panic. She was a poor liar, a panicked gatekeeper fumbling with the keys. "I understand," the calm voice replied, unperturbed. "I'll only be a moment. It's school policy to make personal contact with a student after such a long absence." This was a situation my mother was not equipped to handle. I heard her call out, her voice trembling. "Mother, could you come here, please?" And then I heard the sound I had come to dread more than any other, the sound of my grandmother's firm, measured footsteps descending the stairs. Rose had been in the middle of one of her inspections, reviewing my mother's housekeeping. Now, her castle was under siege from an unexpected direction, and the queen herself was descending to deal with the threat. The tone of the conversation at the door shifted instantly. "Miss Albright," my grandmother said, her voice a smooth, cold cordiality that was far more menacing than any shout. "How kind of you to express such concern. But as my daughter explained, Emma is quite unwell. We are following her doctor's strict orders for absolute rest." "Of course, Mrs. Miller." Ms. Albright's voice remained steady, a rock against which my grandmother's social manipulations broke. "But my duty of care as her counselor requires me to see for myself that she is all right. I'm sure you understand. It would be a dereliction of my professional duty if I didn't." There was a pause. I could picture the scene perfectly, my grandmother's tight, false smile, Ms. Albright's pleasant but unyielding expression. It was a duel of wills on our front porch. "This is a private family matter," Rose said, her voice losing a fraction of its composure. "A student's welfare is a school matter," Ms. Albright countered, her voice still perfectly level. The stalemate must have felt absolute. I could hear my grandmother's frustration in the silence. To refuse would be to admit she was hiding something. To acquiesce was to lose control. She made a calculated decision. "Very well," Rose said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You may have 5 minutes. She is not to be agitated. I will be present for the entire conversation." The front door closed, and I heard their footsteps move into the living room, my grandmother's courtroom. A moment later, my mother appeared at my door, her face pale. "Your grandmother wants you. Downstairs." Now. Walking down those stairs felt like a death row inmate's final walk. Ms. Albright was standing by the fireplace, and she turned as I entered. Her face was kind, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked at me, and for the first time in months I felt truly seen. Not as a problem, not as a liar, not as a vessel of shame, but as a person. "Emma," she said, her voice gentle. "It's good to see you. We've all been worried." I stood silently, acutely aware of my grandmother standing like a statue in the archway, her arms crossed, watching my every move. "I brought your assignments from Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable," Ms. Albright continued, holding out a folder. She kept her tone light, professional, but her eyes were doing the real work. They were scanning my face, taking in my pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes, the way my clothes hung loosely on my frame. She was gathering evidence. "How have you been feeling?" she asked, her gaze direct and full of a meaning I knew my grandmother couldn't decipher. "I'm fine," I managed to whisper, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I kept my eyes on the floor. "Are you sure?" she pressed gently. "You can tell me if you're not." My grandmother shifted in the doorway, a tiny, menacing movement. I felt her disapproval like a cold draft. I couldn't speak. The words were trapped in my throat, held there by a wall of fear, but my body betrayed me. My eyes, against my will, lifted to meet Ms. Albright's, and in them she saw it all. She saw the terror. She saw the desperation. She saw the silent, frantic scream of a girl drowning in plain sight. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head, a gesture of pure, involuntary negation that lasted only a second. But a second was all she needed. A shift occurred in Ms. Albright's demeanor. The professional kindness remained, but underneath it, a new, hard resolve had formed. She had her answer. She had heard my silent scream. She smiled at me. A different kind of smile now, one that held a promise. "Well, it was good to see you, Emma. You just focus on getting better." She turned to my grandmother, her expression once again professionally placid. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Miller. You've been very accommodating." She walked to the front door, my grandmother following her like a hawk. I remained frozen in the living room, my heart pounding with a terrifying, unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. As Ms. Albright opened the door to leave, she paused and turned back, her eyes meeting Rose's. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was calm, clear, and carried the unyielding weight of the law. "If I don't hear from Emma at school on Monday, or if I am unable to speak with her privately before then, I will be legally obligated to file a report with Child Protective Services." She did not wait for a reply. She simply turned and walked away, closing the door softly behind her, leaving her words hanging in the air like a declaration of war. The fortress had been breached. The outside world had smashed a window and was demanding entry. My grandmother stood in the hallway, her face a mask of incandescent fury. My mother looked from her to me, her expression one of utter panic. The ticking clock of their carefully constructed world had been replaced by a new one. The fuse had been lit. They had until Monday, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would do anything at all, to extinguish it. The moment the front door clicked shut, sealing Ms. Albright's ultimatum in the air behind her, the fragile composure of my family shattered. My mother let out a strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth as if to physically hold back her hysteria. "Child Protective Services," she whispered, the words themselves a venomous curse. "Oh, Mother, what are we going to do?" My grandmother, however, did not panic, not in the way my mother did. Her face, which had been a mask of fury, settled into something far more terrifying, a state of cold, absolute rage. Her eyes were like chips of granite. This was not a problem to be wept over. It was an enemy to be defeated. The ticking clock had started, and she was already calculating her counterattack. "Stop your sniveling, Sarah," she snapped, her voice cutting through my mother's fear. "Tears are useless." She turned her gaze on me, and it was pure, unadulterated loathing. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To bring ruin upon us? Go to your room." I will deal with you later. Her command was so absolute that I obeyed without a thought, my legs carrying me up the stairs. I closed my bedroom door, but I didn't go to my bed. I stood with my ear pressed against the wood, listening. The house, which for weeks had been a tomb of silence, was now alive with frantic, muffled energy. I heard my grandmother on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur, too quiet to make out the words, but sharp with command. I heard my mother pacing back and forth in the living room below, her footsteps frantic and uneven. The house was a hornet's nest, and I had just kicked it. Hours passed. The sun went down, and the house fell into a new kind of quiet, a tense, waiting silence. They were plotting. They were building a new, stronger cage for me, one that even Ms. Albright couldn't breach. Sometime after dark, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I crept to my window and peered through the curtains. It was my uncle's car. He got out and walked quickly to the front door, his face not smiling or charming, but grim and set. The pretense was over. The family's war council was now in session. It was close to midnight when my mother opened my door again. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "They want to see you," she said. Downstairs. The living room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like a scene from a nightmare. My grandmother was seated in her usual armchair, a queen on her throne. My mother stood near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief in her hands, and on the sofa, lounging with a casual arrogance that turned my stomach, was my Uncle David. He didn't look at me as I entered, but I could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from him. He was a silent, triumphant victor, here to witness my final surrender. "Sit down, Emma," my grandmother commanded, gesturing to the hard-backed chair they had placed in the middle of the room, directly facing them. It was an interrogation. I sat, my hands clenched in my lap. Rose let the silence stretch, a form of psychological torture she had perfected. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and clinical. "As you know," she began, "your little performance this afternoon has created a complication. This Ms. Albright, this meddling outsider, has threatened our family. She has given us until Monday to resolve the situation you have created." She paused, her eyes pinning me in place. "So, we have resolved it. We have come up with a solution. A generous solution, considering the circumstances." She leaned forward, her hands steepled under her chin. "Here is what will happen. You will be leaving Havenwood for a while. We have found a place for you, a quiet, discreet home for young women in your condition. Margaret's. It is run by nuns, several hundred miles from here. They are very experienced in these matters." My blood ran cold. "Leaving?" I whispered. "You will stay there until the baby is born," she continued, ignoring my interruption. "The child will be given up for a closed adoption. A good Catholic family will take it, a family that can give it a proper life. It will be clean, anonymous, no one will ever know. It will be as if it never existed." As if it never existed. The words were a knife twisting in my gut. For the first time, a fierce, protective instinct flared inside me. It was not just a condition, it was a baby. My baby. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I won't." Rose's eyes narrowed. David shifted on the sofa, a flicker of amusement on his face. My mother let out a small, wounded sound. "You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice," Rose said, her voice dropping to that familiar, venomous level. "Let me be perfectly clear about your position. You are a minor. You are unwell. If you refuse this very sensible and compassionate offer, I will have no alternative but to conclude that you are mentally unstable. Your wild accusations against a respected member of this community, your self-imposed isolation. Dr. Miller has already expressed his concerns about your fragile state. It would be a simple matter to have you committed." She leaned forward again, her words precise and brutal. "Imagine it, Emma. A hospital. A locked room. No one will ever believe a word you say again. You will be the crazy girl who made up stories. And your baby, the state will take it from you anyway. They will place it wherever they see fit. You will have no say. You will have nothing. you will be erased. Is that the life you want for yourself? The threat hung in the air, absolute and suffocating. I looked from her face to my uncle's. He was watching me, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. He was savoring my destruction. I looked at my mother, my last pathetic hope. She was weeping again, but her tears were not for me. "Please, Emma," she begged, her voice watery and weak. "It's for the best. It's the only way we can all get through this. It's the only way to save our family." Our family. The three of them. I looked at the prison they had built for me. And now they were offering me 2 doors. Behind one door was a mental institution, a life of sedation and whispers, a place where my truth would be officially declared a symptom of madness. My child would be lost to the system, and I would be lost with it. Behind the other door was this bargain, this monstrous, horrifying deal that would send me into exile and steal my child, but would eventually return me to the world. It was a choice between total annihilation and a future that was merely shattered beyond repair. It was no choice at all. As old Emma, I understand now that in that moment of utter desperation, the bargain seemed like a form of escape. An escape from that house. An escape from their faces. An escape from David's triumphant gaze. It was a trade of one prison for another, but the new one was far away, and for a 16-year-old girl who had not seen the sun in weeks, far away sounded almost like freedom. I slumped in the chair, the last ounce of fight draining out of me. The rage, the fear, the tiny flicker of protective love for the life inside me. It was all extinguished by the cold, hard reality of my powerlessness. I looked at my grandmother, the architect of my ruin. "I agree," I whispered. The words were a puff of air, the sound of a soul surrendering. A thin, satisfied smile touched Rose's lips. David leaned back into the sofa cushions, his victory complete. My mother closed her eyes, a sigh of pure, selfish relief escaping her. The devil's bargain had been struck. And my part in it was to be the sacrifice. The days between the bargain and my departure were a gray, silent flurry of preparations. My life was being packed into a single, cheap suitcase by my mother, whose hands moved with a cold, robotic efficiency. She did not pack the dress I loved, or the records I listened to in the dark. She packed sensible, anonymous things. Plain sweaters, dark skirts, sturdy shoes. It was a wardrobe for a ghost, for a girl who was about to be erased. My grandmother oversaw the entire operation, her presence a constant, chilling reminder of the terms of my surrender. "The bus leaves at 6 a.m. on Thursday," she announced one evening, as if discussing a delivery schedule. "Sarah will take you. I have already wired the funds to St. Margaret's for your first 6 months." It was a business transaction, and I was the commodity being shipped. On that Thursday morning, the world was still cloaked in a damp, pre-dawn darkness. The house was silent. I walked down the stairs with my single suitcase, a stranger leaving a house that was no longer my home. My mother was waiting by the door, her coat on, her car keys in her hand. She didn't look at me. The car ride to the bus station on the edge of town was filled with a silence that was heavier than any words. This was the end. I watched the familiar sleeping houses of Havenwood slip by, and I knew I was seeing them for the last time as the girl I used to be. The person who returned, if she returned at all, would be someone else entirely. The bus station was a dreary, soulless place, smelling of diesel fumes and stale coffee. A few lonely-looking travelers were slumped in the hard plastic chairs under the buzzing fluorescent lights. It was a place for people with no destination, only a departure. My mother bought my one-way ticket, her movements stiff and awkward. As the bus hissed and groaned at the curb, she turned to me. This was the goodbye. It was as pathetic and as hollow as I knew it would be. "You be safe, Emma," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder. She couldn't look at me. She couldn't face the daughter she was exiling. She reached into her purse and pulled out a clumsy wad of cash, pressing it into my hand. "For extras," she said. "Just in case." It wasn't a gift, it was a payoff, it was the final transaction. I took the money and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The bond between us had been so thoroughly corroded that it had finally broken, leaving only a sad, awkward silence between two strangers. I turned and walked toward the bus without looking back. As I climbed the steps, the driver grunted, and I found a seat by a grimy window. I watched my mother get back into her car and drive away, disappearing into the gray dawn without a wave. Then the bus doors sighed shut, and with a lurch, we pulled out onto the road. As the bus left the city limits of Havenwood, a strange, terrifying, and utterly unexpected feeling began to creep through my numbness. A sliver of freedom. For the first time in months, no one was watching me. I was no longer under the suffocating gaze of my grandmother, my mother, or my uncle. The air on the bus, stale as it was, felt clean. The future was a vast, terrifying blank, but it was blank. It was not the pre-written, foregone conclusion of my life in that house. I was 16, pregnant, and being sent into exile, but I was, for the first time in a long time, utterly alone with my own thoughts. And in that solitude, a hard, cold knot of resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. They had taken everything from me, but they had not taken my life. I will survive this. I vowed to the passing, unfamiliar landscape. I will not let you erase me. I will survive. Hours later, as Ohio's flat fields gave way to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, I remembered the money my mother had given me. I pulled the wad of bills from my coat pocket. It felt wrong in my hand, tainted. I began to straighten the crumpled notes, intending to count them, when my fingers brushed against something thick and folded, hidden within the bills. It was a small, brittle square of paper, yellowed with age. I carefully unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping. The print was small and faded. The article itself, no more than a few inches long. The dateline was from a town I didn't recognize, from 15 years prior. The headline read, "Local teen dies in tragic fall." My eyes scanned the text. It was about a 17-year-old honors student who had fallen from a local scenic overlook known as Miller's Peak. Her death was ruled an accident. She was remembered by her teachers as a bright, promising girl. And then I saw it, the line that made the air freeze in my lungs. The article mentioned she had been a dedicated volunteer in the community, actively mentored in her service projects by local businessman and civic leader, David Miller. And underneath the girl's printed name, Anna Jensen, was a faint but deliberate underline, drawn in pale blue ink. The bus, the road, the world outside my window, it all disappeared. I was holding a ghost in my hand. This wasn't a random piece of paper. This was a message. This was a warning. My mind reeled, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. This clipping, it could not have come from my mother. Not the woman who had just driven me to my exile, the woman whose cowardice was a force of nature. To do this would require a kind of courage, a kind of rebellious fury she simply did not possess, and yet, the money had come from her hand. The only explanation was a moment of profound, conflicted guilt, a final, desperate, almost unconscious act of sabotage against the system she was too weak to fight. She had passed it to me without even knowing what it truly was, a final, ghostly act of a mother she could have been. And the meaning of it was as clear as it was monstrous. My uncle, this wasn't the first time. Anna Jensen, an accidental death. A girl he was mentoring. It was my story, but with a different, more final ending. He had done this before. And my grandmother, dear God, my grandmother, she must have known. This wasn't just about protecting the family's reputation from a single scandal. This was a cover-up, a long-running conspiracy to protect a predator, to bury his secrets no matter the cost. Anna Jensen was the cost then. My baby and I were the cost now. My personal tragedy, the one that had consumed my entire world, suddenly expanded. It was no longer just mine. It was linked to another girl, a girl who hadn't survived to tell her story. The vow I had made to myself just hours before, the vow to survive, was no longer enough. It was imbued with a new, harder purpose. This was not just about me anymore. This was about Anna. I carefully folded the tiny yellowed clipping and tucked it deep into my wallet. It was the most precious thing I owned. It was evidence. It was a weapon. The bus continued on its long road, carrying me further and further from Havenwood, but I was no longer a frightened girl being sent into exile. I was a witness, carrying a ghost's testimony. The road ahead was still dark and unknown, but for the first time, I felt like it might be leading somewhere. It was leading toward a reckoning. Time is a strange and fluid thing. It can be a torrent, a relentless current that sweeps you forward, the years blurring into an indistinct rush. It can also be a stagnant pool where a single moment stretches into an eternity, its reflection staring back at you, unchanged, for the rest of your life. My life has been both. The weeks in my gilded cage, the long, lonely bus ride from Havenwood, those were stagnant eternities. The 54 years that followed? A torrent. A blur of grit and reinvention, of building a fortress around myself so impenetrable that no one could ever lock me in a room again. The bus did not take me to St. Margaret's. I cashed in the one-way ticket at a station in Pennsylvania and used my mother's blood money to buy another, heading west. The girl who arrived in a sprawling, anonymous city bore little resemblance to the one who left Ohio. I gave birth to my son in a charity hospital, a lonely, terrifying ordeal that remains the sacred, defining pain of my life. I held him for 1 hour. I memorized the shape of his hands, the whirl of his dark hair, the scent of his skin. I named him Leo. And then I signed the papers, the closed adoption my grandmother had wanted, but on my own terms, in a place she could never trace. I handed my son, my only child, to a nurse with kind eyes and walked out into the world, hollowed out and utterly alone, but free. I never went back. Not to Havenwood, not to Ohio. I worked menial jobs, saving every penny. I put myself through night school, then college, then business school. I discovered I had a mind for numbers, for systems, for seeing the patterns that others missed. A skill, I suspect, honed by years of silently observing the complex, toxic dynamics of my own family. I started a small consulting firm from a one-room apartment. It grew. I was ruthless, tireless, and driven by a cold, quiet fury that I channeled into ambition. Over the decades, I built an empire of my own making, a world of glass and steel and balanced ledgers, a world as far from the suffocating floral wallpaper of Havenwood as I could get. I never married, I never had other children. Leo was a ghost I carried, a phantom limb I could still feel. My success was a monument built on a foundation of profound and unending grief. Now, at 70, my world is one of ordered, minimalist perfection. I live in a penthouse apartment overlooking the sprawling, indifferent heart of Chicago. The view from my window is not of maple trees, but of skyscrapers, their steel skeletons a testament to will and ambition. The silence here is not the heavy, watchful silence of my childhood home. It is the clean, empty silence of solitude, a silence I have curated and control. I was in my study reviewing financial reports when the phone rang. It was a private line, one few people had access to. I answered with my customary crisp tone. "This is Emma Miller." The voice on the other end was hesitant, male, unfamiliar. "Miss Miller? Emma? My name is Robert Finch. I'm the executor of your grandmother's estate." He paused, clearing his throat. "I'm calling with some difficult news. Your grandmother, Rose, passed away peacefully in her sleep last night. She was 98. I felt nothing, no shock, no grief, no satisfaction. It was simply the arrival of a piece of information I had been expecting for decades. It was a single, long overdue domino finally falling." "I see," I said, my voice perfectly even. "Thank you for letting me know." The lawyer seemed taken aback by my composure. "Ah, yes. Well, the funeral is scheduled for Saturday in Havenwood. The reading of the will is to follow at the house. The family, they expressed that they hope you will be able to attend." The family. The word was a joke. My mother, Sarah, had passed away 15 years ago, a quiet, faded woman to the end. I'd received a similar call then and had sent a check to the funeral home, but did not go. And David? I had learned from a clipping sent by a hired information service years ago that my uncle had drunk himself to a pathetic, lonely death a decade past. His liver failed him before my justice ever could. Rose was the last one, the alpha and the omega of my suffering, the final piece on the board. "I will make my arrangements," I told the lawyer, my tone leaving no room for discussion. I ended the call and stood up, walking from my study into the vast, open-plan living room. The afternoon sun glinted off the polished chrome and black leather of my furniture. On the far wall was a large, frameless mirror. I walked toward it until I was standing directly in front of my own reflection. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to the girl on the bus. Her hair was a chic, sharp cut of silver, her eyes clear and discerning behind elegant glasses. She wore a tailored silk blouse and trousers that cost more than my mother's car. Her posture was perfect, her face a mask of poised, formidable control. She was a fortress, she was a success, she was a survivor. But as I looked closer, into the eyes of the woman in the mirror, I saw her. The 16-year-old girl was still there, huddled in the shadows behind the formidable façade. I could still feel her terror, her shame, her profound and hopeless loneliness. For 54 years, the woman in the mirror had protected that girl, had built this entire world to keep her safe. But safety was not the same as peace. The news of Rose's death was not an ending. It was a summons. It was the starting pistol I had been waiting half a century to hear. My entire life since that bus ride had been a preparation for this moment. The wealth, the power, the independence, they were not just for me. They were tools. They were weapons. I stared at my own reflection, at the 70-year-old woman and the 16-year-old girl who resided in the same body. The debt owed to that girl had been accruing interest for 54 years, and the time for payment had finally come. They say you can't go home again, but sometimes you must, especially when you have an old debt to collect. The journey back to Havenwood was the inverse of the one I had taken 54 years ago. I did not travel by bus, a solitary, frightened girl. I arrived in a hired black car, a woman of means and intention, returning to a place I had outgrown. The town was smaller than I remembered, the once imposing buildings now seeming quaint and slightly tired. The same names were on the mailboxes, the same ancient oak tree stood sentinel in the town square. It was a place caught in amber, a perfect specimen of a past I had fought my entire life to escape. The funeral was a masterclass in small-town hypocrisy. The church was full. Speaker after speaker stood at the pulpit and eulogized Rose Miller as a pillar of the community, a woman of faith, a matriarch who held her family and her town to the highest standards. They spoke of her generosity, her strength, her unwavering character. I sat in the back pew, a silent, elegantly dressed ghost, and listened to the construction of a myth. My presence caused a ripple of whispers. "That's the other one, the one who left." They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and old, ingrained judgment. They had no idea I was not there to mourn, but to bear witness. The final act was set to take place in the house on Elm Street. As I walked up the flagstone path, the house seemed to hold its breath. It was the same, yet different. The furniture was the same. The photos on the mantelpiece still smiled their perfect hollow smiles. But the suffocating force of my grandmother's will was gone, leaving behind only the stale, cloying scent of secrets and lilies. The remaining family was gathered in the living room, the courtroom. A few distant cousins I barely recognized, their spouses, their adult children. They were strangers to me, vultures in mourning clothes, their faces arranged in masks of solemn grief that did little to hide the greedy anticipation in their eyes. They nodded at me stiffly, their gazes lingering. I was the family pariah, the prodigal daughter who had never returned. Beside me, a quiet pillar of strength in a perfectly tailored suit, was my lawyer, Mr. Davies. Mr. Finch, the estate's lawyer, cleared his throat and began to read from the document in his hands. Rose's will was exactly what I expected, her final, posthumous performance of piety and power. The bulk of her considerable estate was left to the institutions that would burnish her name for eternity. A new wing for the Havenwood Church, a scholarship fund at the high school, a large donation to the local historical society. It was the will of a woman desperate to write her own legacy. The cousins shifted in their seats, their smiles growing tighter as the sums were read out. Then Mr. Finch paused, and finally, he said, adjusting his glasses, To my granddaughter Emma Miller, I leave the sum of $1 so that she may always be reminded of the high cost of family betrayal. A collective, satisfying gasp went through the room. One of the cousins shot me a look of pure, triumphant malice. This was it. The final public shaming, the ultimate victory for Rose's version of the truth. I felt Mr. Davies shift beside me, but I remained perfectly still, my expression serene. I had been expecting this. In fact, I had counted on it. This concludes the reading of the last will and testament of Rose Miller, Mr. Finch said, beginning to fold the document. If I may, Mr. Finch. Mr. Davies's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. He stood up, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. He was an alien presence here, a creature of sharp, urban law in a room of soft, small-town resentments. My client, Ms. Miller, has a claim to present against the estate. A confused murmur went through the cousins. A claim? On what grounds? One of them demanded. Mr. Davies opened his briefcase. We have today filed a lawsuit against the estate of Rose Miller for damages related to conspiracy, false imprisonment, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress over a period of more than 5 decades. He spoke with a cool, devastating precision. The evidence supporting our claim is, to put it mildly, overwhelming. He pulled out a folder. Exhibit A, he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. A sworn affidavit from one Miss Susan Albright, a former guidance counselor at Havenwood High. In it, she details a visit to this very house, where she was systematically blocked from speaking with my then underage client, and where she witnessed a level of fear in a child that compelled her to threaten intervention from social services. He pulled out a second document. Exhibit B, a newspaper clipping from the Millfield Gazette, dated over 50 years ago. It details the accidental death of a 17-year-old girl named Anna Jensen. A few of the older cousins gasped at the name. A girl, the article notes, who was being mentored by the late David Miller. A girl whose death occurred under highly suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. The room was now utterly silent. The cousins' faces were pale masks of horror. And Exhibit C, Mr. Davies said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly as he gestured toward me. The full sworn testimony of Ms. Emma Miller. It is a harrowing account of systematic abuse at the hands of her uncle, David Miller, and of a subsequent conspiracy architected and led by the deceased, Rose Miller, to silence her, to hold her prisoner in this house, and to force her into an exile designed to conceal her son's crimes. He let the words hang in the air. The foundation of their world, the myth of the great Miller family, was crumbling to dust before their eyes. The potential damages in a jury trial would be astronomical, Mr. Davies continued calmly. Far exceeding the total value of the estate. The public revelations would, of course, be devastating for everyone bearing the Miller name. He paused, looking around at their horrified faces. However, my client is not seeking monetary damages for herself. This confused them completely. If not money, then what? We are prepared, Mr. Davies said, to settle this claim and withdraw the lawsuit on one non-negotiable condition. He looked at the will in Mr. Finch's hand. The entire estate, this house, the accounts, the stocks, every last dollar, is to be immediately transferred into a charitable trust. A trust? Mr. Finch stammered. For what purpose? Mr. Davies looked at me. It was my turn. I stood up, feeling the weight of 54 years of silence fall away from me. I looked at the faces of my so-called family, and I spoke for the first time, my voice not loud, but so clear and steady it seemed to shake the very walls of the house. The trust will have one purpose, I said. To establish and perpetually fund a center for young women, a sanctuary for girls who have been abused, who have been displaced, who have no one to fight for them. It will be located right here. In this house. I let them absorb the poetic horror of it. I was taking their temple of secrets and turning it into a beacon of truth. I was taking the cage and turning it into a sanctuary. I was taking everything Rose had built her life on, everything she valued, and turning it to my own purpose. Then, I delivered the final, devastating blow. And the center, I said, my voice unwavering, will be named the Leo House. I said his name, my son's name, the name they never knew, the secret they thought they had erased. I said it aloud in my grandmother's living room, and in doing so, I reclaimed him from the shame they had tried to bury him in. I turned my greatest pain into my greatest legacy. Checkmate. The room erupted in chaos. The cousins were shouting, Mr. Finch was stammering, but it was all just noise. They were powerless. The evidence was absolute. Their choice was between surrendering the inheritance or facing a public trial that would destroy them utterly. I had left them no room to move. My work here was done. I turned, and Mr. Davies and I walked toward the front door, leaving them to the ruins of their inheritance. As I stepped out into the cool, clean air of the afternoon, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt a quiet, profound, and final sense of peace. The debt had been paid. The truth had been given its inheritance. The legal battle that followed was not a battle at all. It was a surrender. Faced with the mountain of evidence and the certainty of public ruin, the cousins folded. Their greed was no match for their terror of exposure. The estate, in its entirety, was signed over to the trust. My lawyers handled the details with cold, quiet efficiency. I did not have to speak to any of them again. I left Havenwood the day after the reading of the will and did not return for many months. I came back in the late spring. The brutal gray of the Ohio winter had given way to a world bursting with defiant life. The trees were draped in a vibrant, almost violent green, and the air was soft and warm. I drove myself this time, in my own car, and parked across the street from the house on Elm. My house. It was no longer a place of darkness. The heavy, oppressive shutters had been removed, and the house itself had been repainted a soft, welcoming cream. The severe, disciplined rose bushes that my grandmother had prized, her symbols of beautiful, thorny control, were gone. In their place was a rambling, gentle garden filled with wildflowers and lavender. The front door, once always closed and locked, stood open to the warm afternoon. The change was so profound it was like seeing a person who had been holding their breath for 50 years finally exhale. A simple, elegant wooden sign was staked in the new lawn. The lettering was clean and understated. It read, "The Leo House." I sat in my car for a long time, just watching. A young woman with a backpack sat on the porch swing, reading a book, her face serene. Two other girls walked down the path together, talking quietly, their laughter a sound this property had likely never heard. They were not broken things. They were survivors, breathing clean air, living in a place built not on lies, but on a foundation of truth. They were living in the sanctuary I had built from the ruins of my own pain. A breeze rustled the new leaves on the trees, and I thought of his name, Leo. For decades, it had been a secret I held tight in my heart, a name I would whisper to myself in the dark. It was the name of my deepest wound. After the adoption, I had been given the option to be notified when he turned 18. I had declined. What would I have done? Appeared in the life of a young man who had a mother, a father, a history that did not include me? To find him would have been an act of selfishness, a desire to soothe my own pain at the potential cost of his. I had to make peace with his absence. I had to let him go, but a name needs a place to live. And now his did. It was no longer a secret whisper. It was carved into wood, standing in the sun for all to see. His name was no longer a symbol of my shame, but a symbol of safety for others. In building a house for them, I had finally built a home for him. I had found a way to be his mother after all. My thoughts drifted to the ghosts of that house, to David, who had rotted from the inside out with his own poison, to my mother, a woman so terrified of the world she could never bring herself to truly live in it. And to Rose, I felt no hatred for her now. Hatred is a fire that consumes the person who holds it, and I had been cold for a long time. I saw her now simply as she was, a woman so imprisoned by her own fear of imperfection that she chose to sacrifice her children and her grandchildren to maintain the flawless façade of her life. She was the architect of her own gilded cage, and she had died in it alone. I did not come here for revenge. Vengeance is a hot, messy, destructive act. What I did was a cold, precise, and creative one. It was an act of reclamation. I did not want to destroy them. I wanted to dismantle the machine of their lies and use its parts to build something that was true and good. I got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, the warm breeze on my face. I thought of my grandmother's final decree, the words that had defined my life, the curse she had laid upon me in that living room a lifetime ago. You are tearing this family apart. A small smile touched my lips. The woman in the mirror, the 70-year-old survivor, finally answered the 16-year-old girl's accuser. My grandmother was right about one thing. I did tear the family apart. I tore it down to the foundation, stone by silent stone, lie by rotten lie, so that something new and something true could finally grow in its place. My work here was done. The debt was paid. I turned away from the Leo house, away from the ghosts and the whispers and the pain, and walked back to my car. I was not walking into a dramatic sunset, but into the simple, quiet, peaceful afternoon of my own life. A life I had built, a life I had earned, a life that was, at long last, completely and utterly free.